As Franklin mentioned, thank you all very much for attending. Franklin's covered a lot of these points, but the intention is we'll have you'll be able to submit questions through the Q&A function. Another Master Gardener, Bob Vaselli, will be monitoring the Q&A panel and providing responses as we go through, and we'll have a session or time at the end of this session to answer any questions that are remaining. Throughout the session, we'll ask you to keep yourself muted, and just a general recommendation, sometimes it's a little bit easier on your own internet connection if you keep your video off, especially during the presentation. You can turn it back on later on in the session. As Franklin mentioned, the topic today is a talk about fire smart landscaping. There have been various presentations like this given in the past through Master Gardeners. Going to have a little bit of a emphasis at the end about what happens if you want to do fire smart landscaping considering the drought conditions, and maybe even provide some additional tips on how to look at and maybe make changes in your garden to both accommodate fire smart landscaping as well as the drought conditions. For those of you who are not familiar with the Master Gardener program, it is a volunteer organization associated with the University of California Cooperative Extension. UCCE provides support primarily to what I'll call commercial enterprises, professionals and so on in the garden and farming area. The volunteers for the Master Gardeners basically take that same kind of science-based information and make it available to homeowners and home gardeners, and provide a facility where people who have questions, want to understand what's going on with their plant, do any kind of investigation on their garden. They can submit questions to Master Gardeners, and at the end of the session, I'll show you how to do that. The important thing to keep in mind as the general principle is that the gardens and the landscapes are really providing environmental health, and that should be an objective of our gardens and our landscapes working together to promote and preserve biodiversity, to be sensitive to the ecology, provide appropriate plants for pollinators and for other species in the garden, and hopefully also be resilient, both from the point of view of adapting to conditions like the current drought, but also be effective in case of things like wildfire. So what we'll try to cover today is talking about a resilient landscape in the broad sense, but specifically from a fire smart landscaping point of view, talk about some basic principles to consider for your particular yard and landscape. Have a little brief comment on plant selection considerations on a very general level. Briefly go over defensible space zones and what you should consider doing within each of the zones that are around your property. And then, as I mentioned before, also talk about a few things that would be considerations given the current drought conditions in Marin and in California, but also that do accommodate fire smart landscaping. So as a set of principles that are basic for creating both a sustainable and fire smart landscape, the idea would be that you select and place plants carefully and have them maintained and hydrated for the particular location in your landscape. It's simple things like, plants that like a lot of sun and sunny location, and then the opposite in shady conditions. Ideally, you lay out the landscape and do the planting so that it's easy for you to maintain. We'll learn later that maintenance is probably the most important factor, especially from a fire smart landscaping point of view, and to some extent also drought tolerance. Keeping in mind that each home and landscape is unique and must be considered individually, it's going to be difficult to give specific recommendations, but I'll talk about some general concepts and practices that would make sense perhaps in your particular landscape environment. Some of the things that I'll mention through this presentation are related to legal requirements from a fire point of view, but I will tell you that most of what we cover is basically recommendations just to be smart about laying out your landscape in your property. There are very few things that are actually strictly required by law, and I'll mention those as we go through. What's important to keep in mind is what we're going to cover is based on science, and that should be important. Those considerations should be important in what you decide to do within your, within your yard. So in general, why is this all more important now? And you may have heard a lot of this in the past, but the reality is that the climate has been changing. I'll give you a couple of key points based on material from other Master Gardener presentations. In San Francisco, for example, the number of hours that are fog-free during the summertime since the early 1900s has declined by 3 hours a day. So essentially, what's happening in the Bay Area is that we're having less of a coastal fog influence. In addition, in that same time period, so 120 or so years, temperatures have actually gone up about an average of 1.5 degrees throughout the year. Now, add to that the conditions where we end up with fires that are becoming more frequent and intense. We have challenges, and add to that now, this year, the severe drought. Just to give you some idea, and you've probably heard the concerns of the fire agencies, since 2000, of the top 20 fires that were the most destructive, 18 of those happened since the year 2000. Likewise, for the largest fires, 17 of those have occurred since the year 2000. And in both categories, over about 6 of the fires that were the either most destructive or largest actually occurred last year in 2020. And that's part of the concern, given the climate changes, why the fire agencies really want people to take action and minimize the risk of fire spreading in their neighborhood and on their property. So in terms of fire, a couple, if you will, formulas to keep in mind is that for fire to take place, you need fuel, oxygen, and heat. You probably all know that. From a fire behavior point of view for the fire agencies, they will say it's the fuel and then the particular weather conditions, how hot and windy it is, for example, and what the topography is like. Are we talking about flat lands or some kind of a slope? Those all influence fire conditions. What we got to keep in mind, though, from a homeowner point of view, is that fuel is anything that will burn. And we'll point out some things specifically through the presentation. People tend to think of it as being vegetation, but that includes landscape mulch. It includes the fence that may start out somewhere in your backyard and runs up to and connects to your house or your garage, the lawn furniture on your deck, planter boxes, and so on. The intention is not to remove all of these items, but to take some action to minimize the risk in some cases, and in other cases, maybe take some actions that are situation dependent. For example, during a red flag day, maybe making sure that your furniture is in a place where it would not, your deck furniture, where the furniture would not catch on fire through ember storms. In general, there are 3 types of fire exposures from a fire agency point of view. You get direct flame, that is, something is burning and on some material, and adjacent material basically catches fire through that flame. People tend to think of this kind of situation as the most frequent way fire spreads, and in fact, that is not true. Another condition is radiant heat, where something is so large and burning so intensely that if you're standing 10, 15, 20 feet away, or some materials within that distance, it would catch on fire. Again, the situations where things do catch on fire, this is not that significant. What the concerns really are, and this frankly is information that's been learned through fire analysis over the last several years, are the embers that spread from things that are burning far away. And those little embers, although they may seem somewhat innocuous, as they build up around any material near a structure, It could essentially cause that material to catch fire and then in turn cause the structure to catch fire. The reality is that from analysis, the view from the fire agencies is that about 60 to, in some cases, 90% of the structures that are burned are actually caused by ember storms impacting a structure in some way, either going through vents or catching material on fire that's adjacent to the structure. So focusing on embers and trying to minimize that risk is really what people should be looking at. So I'll give you a couple scenarios to sort of keep in mind. Here's one where you've got a house that is in perfectly fine shape, yet all of the trees around it have burned, and you wonder how that could happen. Well, I think a lot of it is the steps the homeowner has taken to minimize material that's adjacent to the house. On the alternative, here's a case where all the vegetation basically is green in the vicinity of a structure, but the structure is burned, and it's probably quite the opposite, where material was stacked up somewhere near the structure, that material caught on fire, and in turn the structure caught on fire. And the fire that actually threw the embers could have been a long distance, up to a mile away. So for some general principles you want to keep in mind to minimize the risk of fire spreading from a ground level, grass fire, for example, getting into a shrub, and then from a shrub into trees and so on. And some general rules of thumb: you want to keep your trees limbed to remove any limbs 6 feet from the ground, or up to 1/3 if it's a smaller tree. Correspondingly, if you have a shrub under a tree, and there's nothing wrong with that, you want to make sure that the spacing between the top of the shrub and the lower limbs of the tree is at least 3 times the height of the shrub. In other words, any flame within that shrub could actually go up to 2 to 3 times above the plant, and so anything above that could catch on fire. And as the diagram shows on the right, that's where you can get a case of a grass fire just basically eventually getting into a tree. One other condition, I mentioned this earlier about topography, is slope. The spacing that you want to look at to minimize fire jumping from one group of plants to another varies based on the slope. Since fire will burn faster uphill, what you want to do is have increased spacing as the slope in your property increases. And that spacing change, as shown in the left, would be between groups of shrubs. In the case of trees, it's actually spacing between the canopies of the trees to keep those canopies spread far apart, with spacing in between. So we'll talk a little bit about fire smart landscaping. There are some general principles that would apply regardless of where we're looking within a particular yard. And this list would basically be pretty much true, even if we weren't talking about fire smart landscaping. On a general basis, you want to just try to keep the dead and dying material in your plants removed and put it in the green bin and get rid of them. In the case of fire smart landscaping, you're doing that in addition to remove any kind of fuel ladders where fire could move from one level to another. Provide some separation between groups of plants, create islands, preferably with some non-combustible material between the plants or the groupings. By the way, this is the kind of stuff that an edible gardener would do just to be able to gather material from their edible garden. And so we're using the same principle even in ornamental garden. For fire smart landscaping, you want to avoid planting or mulching close to a structure. And we'll talk a little bit about some specifics, and specifically what's called the ember resistant zone, the 0 to 5 feet from structures. And as I mentioned, you want to make sure limbs are pruned up on trees. Well, you look at all this, and there's been a lot of conversation about, well, aren't there lists of fire-resistant plants? Plants that I would, if I plant them, then I have less of a concern. And the reality is, the answer is no. Under appropriate conditions, all plants will burn. The other side of it is that putting some kind of a list together, because all plants will burn, will tend to leave people complacent that, well, gee, I planted this plant, it's not going to catch on fire, or the risk is low of it catching on fire, and so I've done my job. And the reality is that is not the case. What's really important are the 2 points in the bottom. Where you place a plant or a group of plants is important, and probably more important than that on an ongoing basis is maintenance, which is keeping that plant properly hydrated and cleaned up and pruned as appropriate. If you do have, if you are going to go out and acquire plants, which, by the way, may be something to reconsider right now, maybe put it on the list for the fall. But if you do, what you want to look at are a number of key factors. How big will that plant grow? People tend to put things in and not realize what it'll ultimately get to be in terms of size. Will it thrive? Will it grow? I mentioned earlier about looking at the whether the plant prefers the shady or sunny conditions. Do the soil conditions matter for the particular plant? Or will it survive, for example, in clay soil? From a personal point of view, look at the plant and try to understand better whether you require more maintenance than you're willing to or have time to provide. And that's not just for the initial 1 or 2 years, but as the plant grows, that maintenance requirement may increase. Avoid any plants that are invasive. There aren't really long lists of those, but there are a number that you want to avoid. Otherwise, it's just going to be more maintenance on your part. And all of these really reflect how does the plant change over time. If you've got a smaller tree, you're going to be pruning the lower branches anyway as you encourage it to grow up. On the other hand, the same species, if you're really talking about it wanting to be a multi-trunk shrub, requires a different routine of maintenance, so you need to understand that. We'll talk a little bit about zones, because what's important is what you do in each of these zones, with the idea that what is closest to the house or the structure is the most important area to concentrate. So you really want to start at the what's called the ember resistant zone, or start at the house and work out. I'm just going to mention a few things. If you talk to the fire agencies, they will actually emphasize what's called home hardening or structure hardening, doing things like making sure they have the proper windows and roofing and so on. I'm not going to go into all those details, assuming that, first of all, those are things you may have in mind already. Plus, a lot of those do take some planning and a little bit extra expense. In that 0 to 5 foot zone, however, there are a number of things that you can do that don't require necessarily a lot of expense, maybe a little bit of time and maintenance, and we'll talk a little bit about those. And so we'll emphasize that work first. Then the next zone is the 5 to 30 feet. The idea in that zone is you're providing vegetation appropriate, but with appropriate spacing, minimizing the use of combustible mulch, and I'll get into some detail later. And then as you move further away out to 100 feet, then you can have larger plants, plants a little bit closer together, bigger islands, but again, still providing some spacing between groups of plants. Keep in mind that this set of zones is a recommendation. There are no requirements at this time for things to do in each of the zones, although you probably should keep in mind and keep track of any kind of legislative changes that may be coming down the road, but it'll take a while before that those things will have to be implemented. So in the 0 to 5 feet, also called the Ember Defense or Ember Resistant Zone, the ideal is to minimize or have no plantings within this zone. What you want to avoid, for example, if you have plants like here on the right-hand side, which looks like a California fuchsia, if there's a plant that it gets woody in this area and an ember lands there, then you have a risk of the fire in that plant spreading into the structure. So the ideal is that what you have is non-combustible material in this zone. If you do have mulch, it should be things like gravel and so on, so not using wood mulch. Again, it's not a requirement. If you do have any plantings, then be cautious about putting any plants in front of windows or close to any vents or eaves where embers could get into through the vents, or basically have a fire take hold under the eave. More than any place else, this zone is where you want to remove any dead or dry plant material. And I'll show you some examples a little bit later in the presentation. One of the requirements, and this is a legal requirement, is to remove all limbs 10 feet away from a chimney. The recommendation is to basically apply that same distance from the roof, anywhere in the roof of your structures. So if you want to consider the kind of material to put in that 0 to 5 foot zone, from a master gardener point of view, the strong recommendation is it should be permeable material, so that when hopefully we do get rains in the future, that rain will percolate into the ground, doesn't run off. If you do want to put in plants, one of the more obvious choices are succulents, but you can also put in low growing herbaceous plants that would be well irrigated. Again, if you've got those surrounded by some permeable material, and that acts as somewhat of a mulch that will help both capture and retain water through the seasons. Invariably, there's probably some form of fencing that gets close to the structure, and in many cases actually attached to the structure. What you want to be careful of is a condition where a fire would start somewhere farther from the house, run up a fence line, and through that mechanism actually cause the house to catch on fire. I'm going to make a little recommendation here on the FireSafe Marin website. Well, actually, earlier last month, there were a number of webinars. There were about 2-hour webinars that were given by FireSafe Marin throughout Marin County on summarizing a number of recommendations from the fire agencies. And at the beginning was about 11-minute video that talks, it's an analysis of the glass fire, which was in Santa Rosa, and some of the houses that burned there. And there were several examples there where what was pointed out is a fire actually went up a fence line very similar to this fence that's in the middle, and all the wood along the fence had burned and almost got to the house. Fortunately, someone had realized, was nearby, and broke down the section, preventing the fire from reaching the house. There's no reason to want to use the kind of material like metal or this wire mesh material here. If you want to have a wooden fence, you're more than welcome to do that. But consider doing something like what's down here, having a metal gate, for example, that breaks up that fence so the fire wouldn't necessarily go past the gate. This lower left-hand picture actually shows a similar condition with a wooden fence along one side, and this front section here is a hardy board material. Hardy board is a concrete composite used for siding. You could actually have the last section of a fencing be that hardy board material. Well, what else can you do just to make it a little more interesting? You can put in decorative rock, different colors of stone mulch. Keep in mind, as I mentioned before, permeable landscape, flagstone and brick, but not cemented in place. You might even consider some small water features. Maybe not the best thing to do with the drought conditions, but some kind of recycling water feature could provide not only something of interest in general, but running water a little bit on a fountain would be very, very attractive. Here's a number of examples, photos of different areas and things that have been done within that 0 to 5 feet. As I mentioned, Bob Maselli is helping out with the Q&A. This picture in the bottom is actually of his yard and the changes that he had done, where a lot of this plant material was right up against the house, and basically created this space here with stone, but still had all of the interesting plants just on the other side of that the stone break. On the bottom left is what looks like a lawn. It's actually a drought-resistant grass. So there would be nothing wrong with putting something like that in as well, adjacent to any structures. Just to make the point about wanting to be careful, what you have is a nice lawn condition, a bunch of plants with wooden mulch. Could have been gorilla hair. We'll talk about that in a minute. Basically, everything else looks fine. Embers landed, caught the mulch on fire, which in turn caught some of the shrubs on fire, and as you can see, caused damage to the house. And that's the kind of situation we want to try to avoid. When we go beyond the 5-foot distance, we want to try to use paths that have non-combustible material, create islands of plantings, preferably smaller shrubs and ground covers up to 3 feet. Specimen trees are perfectly fine so long as they're kept well maintained and appropriately hydrated. With the emphasis, and you'll hear this continually, the emphasis on the ability and the actual maintenance of the plants. Mostly perennials, using mostly perennials will minimize the amount of work you'll have to do. If they're well maintained, they will basically create less fuel for a fire. I mentioned the rock mulch and hydration. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but from a drought point of view, this may be a place where you want to look at which plants do you want to focus on in terms of watering conditions. As you get farther away, beyond 30 feet, perhaps wider walks, the use of wood mulch would be fine in this area. Keeping leaf litter, for example, under oaks is fine so long as it's not really deep. If you do have grasses, whether they're lawn type grasses or maybe just native grasses, you want to make sure that they're no more than 4 inches tall. A lot of the native grasses have probably gone to seed by this point in time, so that may be something that's a maintenance job in the next month or so, to cut those down prior to really getting into fire season. When you're looking at this, where to do your work, also take a look at what I call the escape routes. What are those routes you would have to take through your yard to go from your house to your car? And you want to make sure that is cleaned up enough so that there are no concerns if there is a fire of getting from your house to the car to do your escape. Just a couple pictures of examples of California natives. And we'll talk a little bit about plant selection in a minute, but the emphasis would be on using California natives. They tend to be more drought tolerant than non-natives. But you can see that you can have some very attractive conditions using California natives. Keeping in mind that doing a rock wall like this actually provides an additional break in the possible spread of fire that goes beyond just the pathway that's down below. So a vertical separation with stone can provide some kind of a fire break. In the case of mulch, as I mentioned, as you get further away from the structures, you can use wood mulch, preferably composted mulch, which is a little bit less flammable than raw wood. For sure, anywhere in your yard, please do not use gorilla hair. I'll come back to that in a minute about some of the concerns from a fire agency point of view. You don't want any organic mulch in that 0 to 5 foot zone. And if you do have mulched areas, try to keep them separated with non-combustible material. So 2 points about gorilla hair. One of the presentations that were given by a fire agency individual basically said, well, he his comment was that if you look at the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts, they use gorilla hair to start fires when they're out camping. So that just indicates the flammability. In addition, in that review that I mentioned about fires in Santa Rosa, there's a comment by one of the fire personnel that said it took a long time for the fire crews to basically spread the gorilla mulch that just kept on smoldering because it was so thick, and it was just a continual fire threat that they had to take care of. So in summary, for mulch, non-combustible net 0 to 5 foot zone, keep areas in the 5 to 30 foot zone separated with composted wood mulch, or preferably some separations throughout with non-combustible material. Beyond 30 feet, choose larger mulch. In all cases, avoid mulch greater than 2 inches deep. That'll just minimize the risk of fire smoldering if for some reason the mulch does catch on fire. So what do you do? We sort of broken up the actions into these 4 categories about keeping things clean, making sure your plantings are properly hydrated, where appropriate, mulch to retain any moisture in the soil, and do appropriate pruning. The cleanup can be pretty simple: pulling weeds, raking up leaves and needles, cleaning up in terms of your structure, cleaning up the leaves and needles on your roof and in your gutter. One of the actions that might be considered, for example, later in August or early September, is to do that work or have that work done on your house, in part for hopeful winter rains, but also to minimize any issues or risks if there is a fire. Avoid having material under your deck where embers could fall through the deck and basically catch that material on fire. If you do have to do maintenance, preferably things like grass cutting, do it early in the day on cooler days. Avoid doing that on hot and windy conditions. If you do have any wood piles, preference is to keep them 30 feet away from the structure. If that's something you do on a regular basis in the winter, that may mean that you move it closer to the house once the rains start, and then plan on moving it further away from the house when you get into the sort of May, June timeframe. Keep combustible materials, and as I mentioned earlier, there's all sorts of things that you should be concerned about. Keep them away from the house on a regular basis. And if you can't, just have that list that says if there's a red flag day, you do something about moving them away during those conditions to minimize those items catching on fire. If you do have a generator, preferably keep that quite a distance away from your house. These 2 pictures, just as a comparison, shows you the before of perhaps the way some of the yards look, and by doing a little bit of cleanup, you end up with the picture on the bottom right, where things are much more open, much more spacious, and at least from my point of view, much more attractive, and in addition, much more fire smart. Watering, especially important with the drought conditions. You want to maintain your irrigation systems. One of the things you might consider, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, is perhaps making some changes given the drought conditions to make some changes to the irrigation system. But the idea is to focus on keeping whatever plants you do have in your yard properly hydrated. Don't ignore that. If it turns out that for the drought that some plants are going to suffer and perhaps not survive, then maybe it's appropriate to remove them and figure out something to do in the future to replace them. Pruning is going to be important, primarily for the dead material, but also from just an attractive look. Keep the dead and dying material and damaged material away. Open things up. Avoid crossing branches and so on, just common pruning practices. As I mentioned, the requirement is to keep branches 10 feet away from chimneys, and the preference is you do the same throughout around the structure away from the roof. Sometimes people will decide that to control or manage a larger tree, what they want to do is top it. That's probably one of the worst things you can do with a tree. And it's more of an indication of it's the wrong plant in that location. And it may be more appropriate to look at replacing the plant with something that grows to the height that you want it to be. Mentioned earlier about escape routes. There was actually a presentation through Fire Safe Marin by a Master Gardener at the end of May that went into this a little bit more, but identify the escape routes from your house to your vehicle. Preferably find 2 routes, so you know you can do that in case there's a problem in one or the other. Take a look around, assess the health and conditions of the plants along that route. Do they need some pruning? Often there may be, for example, some kind of a hedge. Hedge material tends to get very woody on the inside, and it may require a fair amount of maintenance to clean that woody material, the dead woody material out, and minimize the fire risk from that hedge. And in general, apply the defensible space guidelines. Focus more on that first few feet from the house, and then and along the path, and then have things a little denser or more appropriate when you go beyond the that escape route or away from the house. And it really all hinges around maintenance. If you're talking about your landscape, given the drought conditions, question that a lot of you may have is, well, really, what can I do given the drought conditions, the requirement to minimize my watering with the yard that I have and the plants that are in it? Well, there are some steps that you can take to sort of manage the situation given the drought conditions. The first thing is to really establish priorities. Determine which plants are the most important to you, whether that's because, you know, for example, it's a new tree you planted, it's a fruit tree that you want to retain for a long period of time, a vegetable garden that you want to maintain, maybe some specimen trees. Those are the ones that you want to focus on from a drought maintenance, water maintenance point of view. There may be others that are of lower priority, and you may just decide that it's appropriate to let those suffer a little bit more, not necessarily have them die, but cut back on the watering to those in favor of the ones that you have of higher priority. Adjust your watering practices. I think talk a little bit at the end about the Master Gardener Help Desk. I think one of the more common issues that people have is overwatering versus underwatering. One obvious condition is when you're watering and there's water running on a sidewalk or on a road. You want to minimize that. You're better off cutting back on the watering and monitoring the plants for stress. And you may find that in a lot of cases, you could cut back quite a bit from the watering that you're currently doing or that you've done in the past. Look at your drip system or your watering system and determine whether there needs to be some changes or updates to that. It may be appropriate to reroute or reconfigure your watering system so that, again, the plants that you have for higher priority are getting more water and those that are lower priority are getting a little bit less. As appropriate, hand watering may be a solution. You know, it'd be interesting to just spend a little time in the yard and spend some time hand watering and doing that rather than trying to make changes to your watering system. Mulch is going to be important to keep out, not only retain the water, but also keep out weeds. By doing the weeding, you're actually eliminating competition for both nutrients as well as water for the plants that you prefer. And avoid over-fertilizing. That will just encourage plants to grow, and it will increase the demand on both water and soil conditions. Well, what if you really want to put in a new plant. You know, maybe a situation where you say, well, yeah, it's appropriate for me to take this one out, but I'd like to place something else and replace it with something else. In that case, consider the factors I mentioned earlier about placement and maintenance and growth characteristics of the plant. Evaluate its water needs. There are a lot of California natives, for example, that need relatively little water once they're established. They may need watering during the first year or two, and that's strongly recommended. But you don't need to, they don't need water once you get beyond that 1 or 2 year period. In fact, there are several plants that outright, several California natives, where you should not water them during the summer season. I've gone through that experience myself and killed several as a result. Also consider the other environmental factors in terms of benefits to pollinators and biodiversity, perhaps shelter for ground birds and so on. So there's a number of other factors to consider when you do look at the plants. Maybe an approach at this point is if you decide to remove something and want to replant it, consider the replanting to take place later in the year, which fall was the best season, in part because of hopefully the rains we will get at that time, and just live without the plants that you remove for a couple of months. Bottom line, it's really the right plant in the right place. So from a summary for drought conditions, evaluate your landscape. Consider that you may have to make sacrifices, maybe make in terms of the plants that are being retained or that are going to look healthy. It may mean some sacrifices on your part in terms of a little more maintenance. Add compost and mulch as appropriate to retain the moisture that is that does occur when you do watering. Look at your escape routes. Assess the health and conditions of the plants and just watch it. You know, my recommendation would be if you're watering on some schedule at this point, once every other day or whatever, consider to, you know, add an additional day, make it once every 3 days and see what happens for a period of time. And if you need to step it back up, go ahead and do that. Do apply the defensible space guidelines, and, you know, again, maintenance is important. I want to mention a couple myths that are frankly of concern to the fire agency people as well, personnel as well as master gardeners regarding fire smart landscaping. And by the way, there is on the Fire Safe Marin website a webinar on this topic in more detail. This is just a list of some of the things that are myths that people believe are what is being asked of them in their yard. And I'm just going to mention 2, but they're probably the ones that are most common. One is that, gee, doing the fire smart landscaping means removing all vegetation. That is absolutely not true. As I mentioned, it really amounts to maintenance and making sure the plants are healthy and relatively cleaned up. The other one that's a big factor is, well, it really means we're cutting down, you know, we're being asked to cut down trees. And again, that is absolutely not true. In fact, the preference is to keep the trees for a whole number of environmental reasons. And that is not the recommendation from anybody in the fire agencies. And that presentation I mentioned by Fire Safe Marin covers those 2 points as well as the other ones that are listed here. So in summary, from a planning point of view, think about the things that need to be done. For example, removing combustible material. If you want to change over some plants, go to low growing, well irrigated plants within that 0 to 5 feet. Remove plants or transplant plants that may be under eaves, under or near eaves, windows, or vents. Transplanting may be an option in some cases for plants that you want to retain, but are maybe not in the right place. When you look beyond to the 5 feet distance, going out to 100 feet, larger plants farther away, use wood mulch as appropriate, hardscape to create those fuel breaks between plantings, so that you can maintain those plants appropriately and provide the appropriate kind of spacing between shrubs and trees. From a maintenance point of view, once you've come up with that list of things that need to be done, then it's just basically turning those into actions. And over a period of time, cleaning up the debris and material around the house, especially in that 0 to 5 foot zone, maintaining your irrigation system, checking on it periodically, doing some test runs, getting rid of the gorilla hair if you do have any on your property, and do the appropriate maintenance of pruning to make sure you keep the dead and diseased branches removed. Bottom line is, I think a fire smart landscape can be sustainable, and it can be both aesthetically pleasing, safe, and also support various aspects of the environment. You want to start at the house and work out. That 0 to 5 foot zone is probably the most important. And placement and design are key, with maintenance being essential. So what should you do? I mean, if you wanted me to give you an action list, my first step would be, in the morning or the evening, get an appropriate beverage and do a property walkabout. Take some notes, maybe take some photos, and just look at what's going on in your yard today. Focus on that 0 to 5 foot zone and determine what kind of conditions, given what's been presented so far, what kind of conditions would be appropriate to change. Focus on that 0 to 5 feet to clean up as action, to clean up debris. Maybe you walk around with a bucket and just pick up the miscellaneous leaves that are within that area, and do that on a weekly basis, for example. Make a plan for the next steps. As you go through, you may say, well, gee, there's some plants that really need some significant pruning, but what am I going to do with all the cut material? Almost all the areas in Marin County have Chipper Day offerings that are going on right now, sponsored by the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority through Fire Safe Marin, and that's going to be repeated in August and September. And you can just plan for that next Chipper Day and determine that if it's on a particular day, maybe the week before, you do the pruning to remove those branches that you're concerned about. In some cases, and almost all of the debris agencies have no problem with what I'm about to suggest. Maybe work with your neighbors, and on a rotating basis, share use of green bins. So if you do have a lot of material that goes beyond one green bin, you use the neighbors this week and they use your green bin next week to do yard cleanup. Important is just keep calm and make a plan. What's not being asked of you is to make dramatic changes to your landscape, to be fire smart, or to manage conditions for the drought, but just be thoughtful. So let me just tell you a few things that I've done so far. I did the walkabout, made some notes, got a list. I have to admit, it's several items on the list. I'm starting to work the list. Our neighborhood actually had that Fire Safe Marin Chipper Day a couple of weeks ago. So did some of that cleanup next to the structure, some pruning and debris pickup, and so, as I mentioned, some work for the Chipper Day, and have more planned for the future. And just want to emphasize that the process is gradual. That's an example in my front yard. Around the house, we do have stones up against, various size stones up against the structure. But then I noticed that there's this little pile of leaves that have gathered, because that's where the wind blows the leaves, and therefore the wind will blow the embers, which could catch on fires. And you can see it's not a big distance between this pile of leaves and the wood siding of the house. In the back, slopes downhill. There's an oak tree that's been growing right here, very close to the deck. Been keeping that limbed up. The idea is I want that to grow bigger. There is no reason why it can't or shouldn't from a fire smart landscaping. Some people may say, well, is that risky? Well, maybe, but if the area underneath is fairly clean, there's a low chance that the fire will go from the ground into the tree. In fact, if you ever drive along 101, almost every year I've seen this, you go north, you will see grass fires and singed, what I'll call singed oak trees, but it's the bottom part of the oak tree that's singed, but the entire tree is not destroyed. So I want that one to grow. I'm basically going to maintain that. On the other hand, on another side of the house, I had planted a while ago, a number of years ago, this ceanothus, very attractive. Realized that it's not the right plant right next to the deck. A little bit actually grows under the deck next to the house. Wanted to get rid of it, but realized earlier this year it was absolutely covered with both native and honeybees. So while the flowers were in bloom, I left it the way it is. As I mentioned, we had the chipper day a couple of weeks ago, had that removed, and basically this is what it looks like now with that open space. There's more work I want to do here, but just a couple steps that I took. So if you do have any questions, you're welcome to contact the Master Gardeners. I talked about the help desk. Under normal conditions, you could stop in person. That is not true right now. The way to contact the Master Gardeners, if you do have any questions, is through email at the email ID I've listed there. You will get a response. One of the other things I forgot to mention, Master Gardeners has what's called garden walks. It is sponsored and funded by the water districts. You basically would contact the help desk, ask for an appointment. It's fairly well booked, so it may be a little ways out. And what you end up with is 2 Master Gardeners who come to your yard, spend some time with you, look at the irrigation, plantings, and so on, and make suggestions from a water safety or a smart watering point of view, not necessarily a fire smart point of view. But what you'll probably find is some of those recommendations accomplish both goals of accommodating and adapting to the drought as well as being fire smart. So I'd encourage you to do that. There is no fee for that. As I mentioned, we're all volunteers, and any of the material that's provided is provided through the fire agencies. One other point, and I think it was mentioned by Franklin earlier, there is actually another Master Gardener giving a garden watering presentation, and I think it's next Saturday. So if you want to learn a little bit about watering under these drought conditions, I'd suggest you attend that session. And so that's pretty much the presentation, and I will give it back to Franklin.
So it doesn't look like we have any questions. If you guys want to use the Q&A, Bob will relay your questions. Arlene, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, if anybody wants to ask any questions, if you could, Franklin, monitor who wants to raise their hand, we'll try to take it verbally as well.
So someone's asking, they know that they burn, but should they lean into succulents?
By that, if the question is, do more succulents, I'm not going to say that you want to change your entire garden aesthetic, if you will. Putting in succulents does make a lot of sense. Certain ones can provide, can be a ground cover, and in a way act sort of like mulch in terms of keeping down weeds and so on. I think it's a personal choice.
Okay, we do have one hand raised by Trisha. I'm going to allow you to talk, Trisha, or Trish. You should be able to unmute yourself now. There you go.
Okay. I understand that people are recommending ice plant as a succulent, but my understanding is that ice plant is non-native and invasive. So should ice plant be recommended because it is fire resistant?
So you sort of have, in a way, two questions. So my understanding is what you described is exactly the situation, that ice plant is considered both invasive and it environmentally provides nothing. You probably don't see an awful lot of pollinators, for example, on ice plant. The other thing is that if you actually look at ice plant carefully, that's been around for a while, it has a lot of dead material underneath. And it would just act as a bed for embers to fall in and catch on fire. So for two reasons. One, that I do think it's considered invasive. And I think it is also considered from the fire personnel point of view to be a fire risk. I would not plant ice plant. There are sedums and other similar kind of succulents that would be much more appropriate, and there are native versions of a lot of those that I would recommend instead.
Thank you.
Well, I guess there's no more questions. If you guys have any, this is your last chance, everybody. Oh, Barbara has her hand. Yeah, Barbara, did you want to talk or did you lower your hand? You can unmute yourself, Barbara, if you have a question.
Okay, I just wanted to say thank you for a very well organized and useful presentation. I really appreciate it. I've watched a few and I like this one so far the best.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, I guess that's it, guys. So thank you, Jim, and thank you, Bob. As always, you guys are great. Thank you for this very informative talk. And then in the follow-up email, I'll send links to everybody with the talks, the groups that they talked about. But thank you all for joining us today, and you guys have a great afternoon. So
Thank you very much, Franklin.
bye, guys.
Bye.
Take care.